if anybody has any questions they would like to ask.
Lily has a question. Perfect.
Thank you so much for that. And it was a really great story, too. Nice ending. So I'm curious, in your evolution of thinking about hip hop as a cultural operation, I guess, that and potentially a cultural space, whether you would think about extending this reflection or this translation or interpretation into urban operations. You know, so much of it, I guess one could say that it's. You could say that it's these works are buildings. They're sort of approaches to an artifact, and maybe working with the elements of architecture. But I'm wondering if there's more to a culture and a way of appropriating cultures that is in hip hop, which could be applied to the making of spaces or creating spaces,
Yeah.
access to spaces, to cities. I think that seems like probably another political dimension of hip hop that would be really interesting to hear, you know, how you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. My thinking about it has definitely evolved over the last few years. It actually has evolved most rapidly since the opening of the exhibition in October. And since, you know, kind of talking about the exhibition and the writings that I've been doing, actually starting to write the book in January kind of shifted a lot for me. And then there's another kind of transformation that happened this past week with the show in St. Paul, that, the objects, the artifacts are kind of the least important part of the entire thing. Which is ironic because that's the question I get asked so often. Is like, can you point to a building that's a hip hop architecture building, or is there a practitioner right now who has done a hip hop architecture building? And to me, that's still the lowest on the totem pole, right? What's a whole lot more important than that is some of the methodologies and design processes have been elevated for the last couple of years. And now even that is less important to the kind of attitudes, the kind of postures, the political realms that you talk about. I'm really quite fascinated now in how this starts to transform an urban landscape, how the kind of ideas and policies that come from it can actually affect urban design and urban planning. The two studios that I did at Syracuse on hip hop architecture were actually hip hop urbanist studios, and were challenging students to look at broader spans of land, different sections, and thinking about, okay, how do we appropriate leftover spaces, alley spaces, backyard spaces? How do we carve new paths through the city? Experience the city in a completely different way that you know, that b-boys and graph writers have been experiencing the city for several years, for decades, right? They have a completely different experience of the city. And then space, right? Like space as the kind of beginning and ending of architectural production. You know, Craig Wilkins' piece in Kara Walker's exhibition catalog for Roughneck Constructivists talks about that opens with the fact that he's an architect and that space is his primary medium for creation. And finding or creating hip-hop architectural space requires more than just the elements of architecture. It requires more than just walls and floors and ceilings and furniture and lights. It requires people, it requires activity, it requires programming. So all of these things are all kind of brought to bear at the same time once we open up the conversation from just this narrow kind of AIA definition of what architecture is or what architecture does, and opening it up to the more kind of the newer definition that I'm proposing, which is a reflection of cultural values and cultural identity. Yes, sir.
Like the fact that you're talking about the intersection of like a making process and a way of thinking about designing spaces or urbanisms or everything, that and identity, which I really haven't seen much of in architecture. So thank you for bringing that here. That's awesome. When you're teaching this stuff at Syracuse, how do you kind of toe the line and make sure that your students don't end up like in a culturally appropriative fashion? Like I saw the Hive apartment, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Which is, it looks like pretty blatant cultural appropriation.
Yes.
Like someone just took like a big visual symbol of something that they like made emblematic, quote unquote, of hip hop culture and just like stuck it on a building and like called that hip hop architecture, which ends up being
that's
like
what Amanda was talking about.
right, which ends up like
In the
becoming
video.
black erasure by like some white guy.
Right.
How do you make sure that that doesn't happen when you're introducing something of such like nuance to a bunch of people who are pretty new at it? Like
Yeah,
what are the things that you teach them?
it's a challenge for sure. I don't think I do a whole lot of towing the line. I'm pretty explicit about the intentions of my studios when I teach. Like all of the, so when I recategorize all the work that's in the show, all student work only fits under process, right? It never gets into identity or image, because I recognize that very few, if any at all, of these students directly identify with hip hop culture personally. So I see those studios as really a laboratory for understanding mostly the methods, right? So they're highly methodological and technique based, and getting them to learn, you know, because they're also core studios. So these are 5th semester, 1st semester, 3rd year core studios that have a kind of a responsibility to teach students about designing in urban contexts and larger scale urban design strategies. So they have to learn about diagramming, they have to learn about research, they have to learn about all these different techniques. My attitude is that if you're going to learn about diagramming, researching, and all these different techniques, and in an urban environment, why not just do, you know, use hip hop diagramming and hip hop research and hip hop techniques, right? And so they're very, very methodological, and there is an inherent understanding that that what they're producing are they're just tests, they're just explorations, and they're not explicitly hip hop architecture. I think if you're missing a core self-identification with hip hop culture, then you're not an authentic producer of hip hop works or hip hop products, right? Then it's just cultural appropriation again. Then you're just kind of mirroring certain techniques, and just like so Iggy Azalea was the most often referenced name in the entire 2-day symposium at Cornell. At Syracuse, sorry, because of that question about who gets to practice hip hop, who gets to do this stuff. So it's purely methodological in my studios, but I do want to talk a little bit about something you talked about at the beginning of your question. It's about identity and bringing identity into the studio and into the space. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's completely necessary. It's completely necessary for everyone to design through their own identity, to grapple with what their identity is and find ways of reflecting that within their architectural work. Again, in core studios, that's really difficult to do, and I wouldn't recommend you doing that in core studios. I think the goal there is to to be a sponge, to learn as much as you can, to test everything you can. But you know, if you're lucky enough to get more option studios with people like Amanda, or in your thesis work, right? When in the 90s, again, that was the time, that was the space where we all felt this responsibility to reflect our own cultural identity through the work that we were doing in thesis. And not just explore another vein of architectural production that had nothing to do with identity. So I think it's really important. I'm going to keep advocating for it as much as I can.
Yeah, thanks, Sekou. That was fantastic. I agree with you at the end. The final St. Paul installation was the most true hip-hop. If that's not, I don't know what is. I think the way you improvised and adapted and occupied the space was fantastic, but I'm wondering, when we look at like larger architectural operations at the scale of practice, where we're often beholden to a client or economic and code, these different kinds of ideas, that idea of like an adaptation, improvisation, self-teaching, how do you see the practice and like new modes of practice kind of evolving from this idea of hip-hop architecture where DJing or b-boying, graffiti is all something that can be done kind of, you know, freely? Yeah,
it's a fascinating question, and one that I'm grappling with constantly. I'd like to the kind of ultimate rendition of the book will be a prescription for that, right? That once you've read through the entire book, there is a kind of understanding of what do I do now? How do I approach my own practice, whether it's going to be explicitly about hip hop, directly influenced by hip hop, or just something that is more inclusive in its practices, right? So Craig Wilkins said something at the end of the first symposium in New York where he said that hip-hop architecture should be a model for architectural practice, period. And that really took me aback. I'm like, really? I need to digest that. Is that really true? Do I believe that? Do I agree? And it took me a while to chew on it. Luckily, he was back at the symposium in St. Paul, and he was also chewing on that idea and had a presentation about that, a short 10-minute presentation, which I'm hoping to package and release somehow. But he hit it on the head that all of the things that hip-hop architecture is primarily interested in, they are all on the kind of periphery of practice right now, right? The object of practice is in the center, but practice is defined narrowly around that, and all these things that we're interested in are on the periphery. And what architectural practice needs to do is expand its definition, incorporate some of these things, without having to explicitly be hip-hop architectural practice, right? Just means that it's more interested in social justice, it's more interested in alternative modes and methods of practice, it's interested in reclaiming, fabrication, it's interested in climate change, it's interested in all these other things that we can actually adapt into our everyday practice without being specifically hip-hop. More personally, I have been making more and more attempts to bring that into my own practice. You saw the design study I did. Of course, it's a speculative project. It's not a client-architect relationship. But sometimes you get lucky, and you actually find a client who is really invested in the work of hip-hop architecture, which I have found. And I have like an extra couple slides that I put at the end that now that I talked about them, I gotta show them now. But I put them there because I was, it's work in progress, it's very early work. It's work that I'm not even fully convinced by right now, and I don't know how to talk about it yet, but I have a few kind of preview images of it, so be nice. I keep looking over here at Andrew and Val. I'm like, I don't know what they're going to think about my work. So this is a project in Syracuse called the Good Life HQ, and the Good Life is a foundation that takes at-risk youth from the ages of 16 to 23 and teaches them life skills and entrepreneurship through the lens of hip hop, right? And it's been doing it for the last 6 years, and now they're going to have a headquarters in Syracuse. And this is the building that they chose, that we both chose together. So they enlisted me in the kind of pre-design process. And it's covered head to toe in inside and outside in this amazing graffiti work, on all its sides. And it's in a kind of impoverished neighborhood as well that's on the transition. And so it's the primary site for this. And the approach is primarily to leave the shell as it is. It's a large space. It's a 34,000 square foot space, and we have all these different programmatic elements that we're layering on 2 different floors, inserting it. And so the approach is to keep the building as is and have these 3 primary insertions into that building and have a very clear distinction between the existing and the new. And so what the existing part of the building would be, because this building is kind of an iconic building in the community with graffiti, we're actually going to bring in hip-hop crew or graffiti crews to tag the whole thing again before the final construction, and actually have it be a canvas for continual repurposing and repainting. So every couple years, every year or so, new crews will be invited in as a kind of living artifact. And then the pieces that I install will be a kind of historicization, a multi-layered historicization of graffiti pieces that were there before. So I don't know if you can see this that well, but so on the facade over here, it's kind of a extruded layers of graffiti, and then the other stuff that haven't shown in the image yet is all going to be covered in graffiti as well. So this is more of a kind of graffiti space specifically, not fully hip hop. There are certain things about claiming and reclaiming space that are part of this, but yeah, again, I'm not that, it's still in the works. Yeah, in 6 months I'll have more convincing images of it. Okay. Lily has another question.
Okay. So I love that first slide that you showed. And it was some writing, and I think the first line, I don't remember exactly what it said, but it's something like, "You can't force me to be your description," or something like that. It's the very first slide you showed.
Yes.
And I loved also what you had just talked about, and it's all the aspects of the St. Paul installation was really great. It's certain operations of appropriating, adapting, improvising, reappropriating, repurposing, and so I sense that there's a kind of tension between, I guess, hip hop as a noun and hip hop as a verb or as an operation. And I think that tension comes out.
This one?
No, it was the very first slide of your lecture, which basically said that there's a kind of fluidity, right, of the voice, and of identity even, you might say. I mean, explicitly, it was an argument that you can't pinpoint who I am. And I'm wondering whether, that awkward question about whether, one can truly do authentic hip hop if one doesn't come from a culture of hip hop.
Yeah.
I think that question, I think if hip hop were a verb and it's a critical operation, then that question of identity, of roots or origin wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether origin, genesis, genetics is really relevant to hip hop as an operation. Again, I'm going back to that first. If one were thinking of it as an architectural critical operation, it shouldn't matter that I'm Asian, that I can perform a
Yeah.
critical operation that might challenge others' definition of me or others' definition of architecture, what's
Yeah.
official architecture.
Yeah,
Right?
I think
I could make space for the unvoiced and the marginalized, right?
Yeah.
And appropriate it. And so I guess that to me is a question, you know.
Yeah,
and I'm
I
wondering-
think there's authenticity. Authenticity comes in many shapes and forms. I think you know, there are you know, no one questions the authenticity of Eminem, right? As a rap artist, right? There are b-boy crews in South Korea and in China that are completely authentic in what they do. I have continually rejected arguments that people of a very specific ethnic background are the only ones who are allowed to practice in a very specific way, are allowed to, you know, because even in its genesis, hip hop culture was pluralistic, right? The first graffiti artist to get national attention was, or to get citywide attention, was Taki 183, and he was, you know, Greek, you know, son of Greek immigrants. You know, most of the early b-boys were Latino, were Puerto Rican or Dominican. And, you know, Kool Herc himself, the original DJ, he was Jamaican. So there are some kind of shared histories, shared like commonalities in terms of struggle, in terms of experience here in the United States, or experience within wherever your region is, that connects you or makes you sympathetic to some of the ideas or the attitudes that are implicit within hip-hop culture. Though there is a difference between someone who grew up in a different background or has a different racial or ethnic identity that then decides that hip-hop speaks to them and transforms themselves or feels authentically connected to this culture and decides to express that in and of through their own work, right? There's a difference between that and somebody who looks at hip-hop culture over here and says that, oh, they're doing something really great. I want to be involved in that, or I want to use what they're doing, and I can see either a market for it or an application for it that I can figure out. That to me is inauthentic. That's much more distanced. And that's the kind of history of the Western world. We see things that are interesting to us, that we think are useful to us, and we go out and we take them and we copy them, we mimic them, and we incorporate them into our own practices, without understanding all of what has gone into creating it, without understanding all the kind of codes and the rules of engagement within that realm, without understanding, you know, the kind of lineage of what that means. So it's the Iggy Azalea question. There's nothing that says that her being born and raised in Melbourne, Australia, as a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman immediately disqualifies her from rapping on a worldwide stage. The problem is that she has assumed an identity that's not hers. She changes her voice. She changes the way she dresses. She knows nothing about the history of the culture. She just knows how to do the thing in a way that people like. And doing the thing is very different from reflecting the essence of the nature of the thing, right? And I think that is what I'm getting at here. And to me, that is the core of authenticity.
I wish Jonathan Oxshorn was here. Are you here, Jonathan? Years ago, we had this big debate. Have you ever been to the Earth Room in New York City?
No.
Right here, been to the Earth Room in New York City? Okay. So I'll just cut to the chase. Do you think it's all Earth, or do
It's probably earth covering styrofoam pellets.
To the earth,
Yeah.
you imagine diving into it, it's like the weight of the world, the earth in this loft,
Yeah.
completely defamiliarizing, making things strange. John Osh said, well, how stupid, why would it be real earth? It weighs too much, get there, you never know. So, so the question of authenticity is a really interesting one,
Yeah.
What is authentic, we are now creating touristic trinkets from cities that are made of Florence or made in China.
Yep.
Right? To construct a kind of a narrative. So it's an interesting, that would be a great conference to have.
Yeah.
What is authentic? And why is that not, what really is authentic? Like, who was it who said to Ruben yesterday with Lucy that follows him on Facebook? You don't really know he's getting on a kind of construct that. Well, we know Lubin, so we know he is, but right?
Yeah. Yeah. Authenticity is the second heading in the book right now. The first one is legitimacy, and the second one is authenticity. And then right after that is race and gender. So tackle the heavy stuff first. Yeah, the easy stuff first, yeah. We had one more question here.
Yeah. So I really like how we're redignifying something that's been pushed aside through lenses that are undeniable, through identity, through image. We're taking something that's been cast aside and kind of just saying this has a foundation, and a foundation that has a cultural basis and that has influenced a lot of the urban architecture, has a lot of urban fabric. So it's not a debate that this thing exists, but now we're investigating how it exists and how it manifests.
Exactly.
And so I just really like how the conversation is kind of structured. Also, and about the question of authenticity, I think, I feel like people can usually tell when something is real or it's coming from a place of good intention. I feel like it's not something that you can point out, you deserve to do this, you don't deserve to do this. And also, creating this conversation kind of expands the conversation beyond just ethnic or essentialism, right? By essentialism, it's overcoming all that and now bringing in the question of intention, bringing in the question of motivation behind it and everything. About the St. Paul, I just wanted to ask is, okay, when you entered St. Paul and found the whole mess, isn't the most hip-hop thing to do just roll with it? I'm going back to what Amanda was asking, trying to put something very dynamic into a static facade instead of creating this weird, intricate thing with depth. Isn't that another interpretation of hip-hop architecture that it's I came here and nothing was made, but I'm just gonna do it. And so some places you twist your head to read the graffiti, and the places are upside down and it's mirrored and everything. Isn't that?
Yeah, I rolled with it. I rolled with a lot of it. I mean, there was, and I was prepared to really just kind of accept most of what was there and just kind of adjust things and fix things. That would have been the case if some of the things were wrong or most of the things were wrong. But literally every single thing was wrong. Like there's a line where I actually measured this distance out for him and said, okay, this next row is gonna come here, and I spray painted on the floor. This is exactly where it's gonna go, and it's gonna go down here. You got it? He's like, yeah, I got it. And I come in and it's 14 inches off, right? 14 inches. Like the panels wouldn't physically fit in that space. I would have had to, it would have been complete. I would have had to have come up with a whole new design on the fly, which I get what you're after there. I think on the one hand, I'm super proud of being able to pull that all together and weighing all the options, weighing the time available, weighing the resources, weighing the kind of importance of the show to be right, weighing the kind of architecture part of hip hop architecture, which is still very, very rooted in things that have to work, that have to convey a very clear intention, right? Start from a very clear concept and get translated into physical reality in a clearly kind of linear path. At the same time, your question it reminds me that, you know, there still might be a kind of like cop-out moment too, right? Where I'm just like, I could just like freestyle the whole thing and just say fuck it and just like do whatever. One, that's not me. And second, I think the topic is so important, and the kind of nascent state that it's in right now, it's so important to so many people that we have to get it right. That it was too big a gamble to just say it turns into whatever it turns into. It had to be something really, really good for so many people. Yeah.
Sorry, just a final kind of question. So thinking about what is happening right now to these neighborhoods or these boroughs in New York that are being gentrified and being like washed out, and what we're taking from these cultures, is there, and about your like article in the Harvard about architecture policy, thinking about how architecture policy has really birthed this, is there, like, are there any steps being taken by the architecture community to kind of get into policy and not just the formal kind of theory, so getting into actual, are there people interested in actual policy that puts the hip-hop architecture form that we are investigating literally, like, practically into these neighborhoods or these cultures?
Yeah, well, I think architecture in general should definitely get into policy much more. This is a big reason why I'm still not a member of the AIA, and don't foresee myself becoming a member of the AIA anytime soon, because to me, the AIA should be our advocacy arm, should be getting into policy, should be like, have positions at government levels to influence all these things. At the same time, I'm gonna go back to what the way that I talk about hip-hop architecture, that I still truly believe is that it's not about saving the world, right? It has no intention to save the world, meaning that we have all these problems with social injustice, with gentrification, with climate change, with all these things, but hip-hop architecture is ideally a very pure form of cultural expression, unweighted by all of these different imperatives to like try to change everything and try to make everything better for everybody. As soon as you take on that as your intention, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? The irony is, and you're taking all of the kind of shitty conditions that have been given to us. You're taking, the Cross Bronx Expressway and the kind of bankruptcy in New York City and the terrible living conditions in the South Bronx, and you're turning that into a cultural revolution, right? You're turning that into the most profitable genre of music of all time, right? That's hip hop. It takes all of these different challenges, and a hip hop architecture should look at all these different challenges as resources that it can use to then create something new, something positive, something fun, something uplifting, something amazing, without the weight of trying to solve that problem, right? You see the difference? Like, the problem is there, it acknowledges it, it accepts it, and says, we're not gonna allow that problem to hold us down, we're gonna turn it into something better, something amazing. And if you take that approach, then all these other people who are advocates for all these different institutions can look at it and say, this is a model for how I need to operate in my practice. This is how we can address these social injustice issues. this is how we can address some of these gentrification issues, by looking at what these people are doing by just being amazing, just being awesome, just being hot, right?
Thank you so much. It's been great to see how the, followed your teaching at Syracuse and to see where you're at now. I think there's an inherent contradiction between identity and inclusion, and I think that that's something to think about, because as soon as you talk about identity, then identity involves a kind of denial of the other. It shouldn't, but it sort of implies it. I think we're at a moment when we see, especially in politics, a kind of fostering of extreme identities, and somehow architecture that is always inclusive is one that kind of allows for multiple identities, of course. So I think that that's something to develop on. The other thing I kind of, that thought kind of leads me to think that there's no such thing as an authenticity, because to be authentic in this day and age is kind of impossible. Hip-hop itself is a kind of mixing of so many different things. So there is no one authenticity, and there are probably multiple authenticities, which kind of denies the meaning of authenticity itself, right? There's kind of multiplicity that is authentic, but not a singular moment or singular entity.
I agree with the first part of that, but I don't agree with. I agree with the fact that that there are multiple authenticities, but I don't believe that that undermines the nature of what authenticity means, right? I believe that when I say authenticity, I'm not saying that hip hop is one thing. And if you look at any of my writings, any of the things that I talk about, I would never say that hip hop is one thing. This is the reason why it took me so long to get to a definition of hip hop architecture that I was comfortable with. It took me 5 years to really define it for myself, because as soon as you define it, then somebody takes it and appropriates it and says, okay, now I have this label that I can assign to everything, and this is hip hop architecture, this is hip hop architecture. And then the question of authenticity is about that label. The authenticity that I'm talking about is an authentic form of individual expressionism, right? And so if I express my cultural identity clearly and singularly for me, right, then that reflects a kind of authenticity of myself, right? The collective, and hip hop is always a collective, it's always a collaborative effort, it's always a collective definition, a collective collection of people, a collection of ideas, a collection of thoughts. That collective is going to decide whether your individual expression of yourself is included or not, right? It's kind of, I just got finished writing a whole section about gatekeeping, about like who is at the door, who says who comes in and who doesn't get in, right? And the only answer for that, and anybody in hip-hop culture who self-identifies as being in hip-hop culture will tell you that hip-hop is going to define what is hip-hop. They'll say it over and over again. Hip-hop is going to decide, right? And that's not a satisfying answer for most people, because like, okay, who is this hip-hop that decides or defines or decides who hip-hop is? And it's really a kind of ephemeral thing. It has flowing edges. It's kind of like what Lily was saying about identity being kind of this fluid thing, right? And the identity of hip-hop is fluid. It anchors itself on these elements. It anchors itself on some of the thought ideas that KRS-One has been putting out for a number of decades, and that it has to kind of pay homage to and connect with. But in reality, it keeps changing, it keeps redefining itself, it keeps expanding, right? Unlike architecture, which is really, really slow to expand, it's really rigid in many, many ways, right? It's been trying to expand for so long in so many different ways, but it's still just like, I don't know if we can write that into the codes, or I don't know if we can accept that in a core studio at Cornell University, right? So authenticity has to be first a reflection of individual identity, and then the collective will decide whether that authenticity is also, something that we're comfortable with calling part of our collective. It can still be authentic in itself and be out over here. As long as it's authentic, it's good, right? It doesn't have to be hip hop to be authentic. Okay, that's it. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, thanks. Thank you so much.
Still have a few more copies of this if anybody wants this.